This is the story of a righteous man during the time of the judges. Boaz goes out in the field, greets his reapers, and he says, "The Lord be with you." And they answer, "The Lord bless you," which seems kind of like a routine they might have. Boaz sees this woman gleaning in the field, and he asks who she is. And the supervisor says she's that Moabite that has been helping Naomi. Apparently Boaz has heard really good things about Ruth, goes over and talks to her directly and tells her to stay in his fields and that his guys will offer her protection. He then goes and tells his reapers to slack off and leave a little bit more so that Ruth would have plenty to glean so that she'd be able to take more food home for her and Naomi. At mealtime, he goes to Ruth and makes sure that she has plenty to eat along with his workers, and also that she has enough to take back to Naomi. In other words, Boaz went out of his way to be very kind to Ruth and Naomi. And when Ruth asks him why he's being so kind, Boaz replies that everything you've done from your mother-in-law has been told. In other words, he knows all the stuff that she's been doing. He's pretty well clued into the neighborhood. He appreciates the fact that she wanted to help Naomi so that she wouldn't be by herself. And he ends with this very eloquent passage in Ruth 2:12, that the Lord repay you for what you've done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, whose wings you have come to take refuge. He's rich, he's pretty well networked into what's going on, and he's very poetic. Some historians suggest that Boaz is another name for the judge of Ibzan. Ibzan is mentioned in Judges 12, 8 through 10, and he was a judge after Jephthah. He was from Bethlehem, and it says he judged for about 7 years, and he had 60 kids, so probably he had more than one wife, similar to the judges Gideon, Jair, and Abdon, which also had a lot of. And there's nothing in Ibzan's description that would rule out Boaz. They're both from Bethlehem, both in about the same time frame. And polygamy was allowed under the law of Moses, and Boaz apparently was pretty wealthy, and being wealthy helps since multiple wives and households can get pretty expensive. Ibzan's kind of interesting in that he had, it said 30 boys and 30 girls, so half and half. And it makes a real point about how he married them all to different people in different areas, different clans. So he was really interested in building this networking, is the way we would approach it today. When we get back to the story of Ruth, it's been the end of harvest. So it's been several months since Boaz first met Ruth. They collect everything at the end of harvest. So they have a little party. Boaz has some fun. And then he lays down to apparently protect the harvest. You want to make sure nobody comes and takes your harvest after you've collected it all. And he wakes up in the night to find a woman at his feet. Obviously not worried about social distancing at the time. So Ruth asked Boaz for his official protection. Boaz's response is in Ruth 3:10, and it said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, because you've made this last kindness greater than the first, and that you've not gone after young men, whether rich or poor." This implies that Ruth was probably a young girl, that she would have been much more attractive to a young man. It also implies that Boaz was probably not a young man and maybe not as attractive, but he appreciated the fact that she was concerned with doing the right thing for Naomi and for herself, rather than just going after someone who's more attractive. Boaz agrees to take responsibility, but he says we have to do everything by the book, and that there's a relative that's closer to Naomi than he is, and that he would have first right of refusal. And we're going to call this relative Frank, so it makes the next conversation a little bit easier. So Boaz didn't procrastinate. The next morning he goes to the city gates, finds some witnesses, and Frank happens to walk by. Tells Frank that Naomi's offering her land for sale. Frank says, "Hey, that's awesome, man. Bethlehem's going to be a boom town. Yeah, I'd like to buy that land." And then Boaz kind of drops the other shoe, the way Paul Harvey used to do, and says, "Oh, by the way, if you buy the land, then you also have to marry Ruth." And this is what Boaz says to Frank about Ruth. Once Frank realizes that he'd have to take responsibility for Naomi and Ruth and possibly raise some children, he says, nah, not so much. And he changes his mind about the land. He tells Boaz that Boaz can take the land and marry Ruth, and Boaz says, okay, well, we have to make everything legal. So they do this shoe exchange, which I think is kind of a cool way to end a contract. So I just have in my mind a sports contract where a forward for the Mavericks has signed a deal with Mark Cuban, and he's going to take off his shoe and give it to Mark Cuban, and Mark Cuban has to give him a shoe in exchange. Just seems kind of a neat way of finalizing a contract. So anyway, Boaz marries Ruth, and they have a son named Obed, and Obed becomes the grandfather of David, and Ruth and Boaz are in the genealogy of David and eventually Christ. Some of the things I think that are so neat about Boaz is every conversation he discusses God. He always includes God in the conversations. And that kind of tells you where his mind's at. He's interested in including Jehovah in everything he does. So he's also always kind. He didn't know at the time that Naomi was going to be interested in selling her land, but he was kind to her anyway. And I think that's also very important. When Boaz was asked, he stepped up. He got involved. As an old rich guy, he probably had kids and grandkids. But when asked, he took responsibility for Naomi and for Ruth and for Obed and for a whole new family. I think this story is a great example of how a righteous person should act. During the time of the judges, there weren't a lot of examples of righteous actions, but I think Boaz gives us an example. I don't see Boaz and Ruth as a love story, which I know is kind of disappointing, but to me it's even better as a story about people trying to do the right thing, or how God took care of them. Thank you.